An arrogant tourist knocked off a guard's hat, confident that he could get away with anything. But a step forward from the guard made the crowd freeze and left the tourist regretting everything. London, majestic and stern, began. Another day under the gray blue sky. Outside Buckingham Palace, everything was unfolding as usual. Tourists snapped photos, children darted about, and the Queen's guards stood vigilant, embodying British tradition. Sunlight broke through the clouds, highlighting the brilliance of their red uniforms and imposing bearskin hats. These stoic figures always elicited admiration from some, respect from others, and, as it turned out, a mischievous desire to provoke in a select few. Standing at his post was Guardsman William Carter, a man in his 30s. His face was expressionless, his gaze steady and serious. He seemed the living embodiment of honor and discipline. Onlookers gazed at him with awe, appreciating the sheer willpower it must take to remain unflinching amid the noise, laughter, and relentless cameras. But amidst this bustle was someone who had no intention of respecting tradition. The crowd parted like water to let through a massive man in his 40s. Stocky, red-faced and with an audacious gleam in his eyes, he pushed his way forward as though he were the main character in the day's story. His green jacket strained against a protruding belly, and overly tight jeans accentuated his disheveled appearance. A crumpled, stained baseball cap perched crookedly on his head. This was Johnny, a textbook example of how alcohol can turn an ordinary man into a walking disaster. "Hey, buddy," he bellowed, clutching a plastic cup with the remnants of beer in one hand and waving the other as if trying to command the entire square's attention. "You even alive? Or just here for decoration?" His loud voice cut through the crowd's hum, drawing glances from tourists. Some giggled, others turned away in discomfort, but most pulled out their phones to record. William, as protocol dictated, remained unmoved. His face stayed as calm and steady as any royal guardsman's should. Johnny, emboldened by the attention, was just getting started. He trudged forward, invading the space of those closest to the guard. "Come on, at least blink. I'm here for a show. Don't let me down," he slurred, shambling closer to the forbidden white line marking the boundary not to be crossed. The crowd's focus was now entirely on this absurd scene. Some chuckled from the sidelines, entertained by the supposed bravery of a man trying to provoke a royal guard. Others were visibly uncomfortable. A middle-aged man shook his head disapprovingly, whispering to his companion. A young woman in a sharp business suit leaned down to her child and said, "See? That's exactly how not to behave. It's a bad example." But Johnny wasn't listening. In his mind, he was the day's hero. To him, the guard was nothing more than part of the scenery, like the gates or the flag. "Isn't this all for us?" he thought smugly. In Johnny's distorted worldview, British traditions were merely tourist attractions, there to be toyed with, and, since he was paying for the experience, he believed he could do whatever he wanted. The crowd began murmuring. Some openly criticized Johnny's behavior, while others egged him on. "Go on, make him laugh," someone shouted from the back. The tension in the air grew. Johnny, emboldened by alcohol and the audience's attention, finally crossed the white line, standing just a few steps away from the unflinching William. His smirk widened, and his gaze grew even cockier. "Listen, pal, you're here for us, so do something already," he barked, sloshing his beer and letting a few drops splatter onto the cobblestones. William stood as still as a statue, his expression unchanged. But even in his stillness, he commanded respect. This only infuriated Johnny further. The crowd, sensing the escalating conflict, held its collective breath. Johnny, now fully immersed in his one-man show, decided to up the ante. With a drunken swagger, he leaned in closer to William, shouting insults and gesturing theatrically. The guard remained unmoved, his steely gaze fixed on the horizon. And then, in a move that shocked everyone, Johnny reached out. With a swift, arrogant motion, he slapped William's shoulder before swiping the bearskin hat off his head. The heavy hat fell to the ground with a dull thud. The crowd gasped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Even the rowdiest onlookers froze, stunned by Johnny's audacity. Phones were now trained solely on him, recording every second. Johnny, reveling in what he thought was victory, threw his hands in the air, expecting applause. But the smug grin on his face began to falter as he noticed no one cheering. "Hey, it's just a joke. Lighten up," he stammered, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. William finally moved. Slowly, he bent down, picked up his hat, and brushed off the dust with deliberate precision. His movements were calm and dignified, as if to emphasize his unshakable resolve. Straightening up, he placed the hat back on his head. For the first time, he turned his icy gaze directly on Johnny. "Step back behind the line. Now," William commanded, his voice clear and firm, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like thunder. The words sent a jolt through the air. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. Johnny, who had moments ago been the self-proclaimed king of the square, now looked bewildered. "Whoa, all right? It was just a joke," Johnny stammered, stepping back hesitantly. Sweat trickled down his reddened face as he stumbled over his words. But William didn't let up. Taking a step forward, he intensified the pressure. "I said, now." The authority in his voice was undeniable. Johnny, now fully deflated, retreated clumsily, nearly tripping over the curb. Laughter rippled through the crowd, not with him, but at him. "Good on him!" someone shouted, and applause began to spread. Johnny, no longer the star of his imagined show, slinked away, humiliated. The crowd rallied behind William, cheering him on as the guard returned to his post, as unshakable as ever. Though William resumed his stoic stance, his unyielding presence sent a clear message. British traditions and honor are not to be trifled with, no matter how bold or foolish the challenger. Johnny stumbled backward. His bulky frame moving clumsily like a lumbering bear suddenly reminded it didn't belong there. At one point, his foot caught on the cuff of his own jeans, and his phone slipped from his sweaty hand, hitting the cobblestones with a loud thud. The crowd couldn't suppress their laughter. This moment, so obviously ridiculous and humiliating, marked the culmination of his self-styled performance. "That's a lesson for you, buddy," someone called from the back of the crowd. Johnny hastily bent down to retrieve his phone, but his face betrayed everything: confusion, anger, and shame. He glanced around at the crowd, seemingly searching for support, but all he found were judgmental stares and barely contained chuckles. When he finally picked up the phone, a crack stretched across the screen. This only deepened his irritation. He shot an angry glare at the laughing onlookers but didn't dare say another word. The confidence he had flaunted minutes earlier was now utterly deflated. Meanwhile, William, utterly composed, leaned down and picked up his bearskin hat, brushing off invisible specks of dust with meticulous care. His movements were so precise and deliberate, it seemed as if he had rehearsed them countless times. Straightening the hat and adjusting his uniform, he stood tall once again, resuming his post like the living embodiment of British dignity. The applause came almost instantly. First, a lone clap, then another, and soon the entire crowd erupted in cheers. The sounds of approval and admiration filled the square. "A true hero!" someone shouted from the throng. Faces in the crowd lit up with respect. Some removed their hats, others clutched their phones, still filming, while voicing their praise. The mood had shifted entirely, with justice and poise winning the day. And Johnny? He stood off to the side, his face burning red with shame, barely concealed under the brim of his grimy baseball cap. He tried to appear indifferent, as though the unfolding scene had nothing to do with him, but the beads of sweat dripping down his forehead told a different story. "Let's just forget about this," he muttered, hoping his words would dissolve into the noise of the crowd. But the crowd wasn't ready to let him off so easily. "Maybe it's time to go home, don't you think?" A young man in the front row quipped, triggering another wave of laughter. Johnny, thoroughly humiliated, turned on his heel and hurried away. His massive frame, once a source of arrogance, now seemed pitiful as he weaved through the crowd that no longer found him amusing. Alone and defeated, he realized his performance had ended in nothing but disgrace. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with conversation about the event. Cameras were turned off, and voices grew louder as people praised the guard for his calm and dignified response while criticizing the tourist for his audacity and disrespect. As the square returned to its usual hum, an elderly man with a cane approached William. His posture was upright, and a veteran's badge gleamed proudly on his chest. This was Mr. Graves, who had been quietly observing the entire scene from the sidelines. "Well done, son," he said, his voice firm but kind. "You remind us that honor is still alive."